start. So then whoever need to join us a little bit later, they could. So again, thank you so much for joining us. So this spring semester, we have 3 sessions of faculty spotlight featuring our second year tenure track faculty. And so today is our first episode featuring 3 professors, Professor Bob Bishop, Dr. Bob Bishop from Philosophy Department, and Dr. Jonathan Robinson Anthony from the English Department, and also Dr. Debora Pérez Torres from the Communication Center Department. So first, I want to thank the presenters today for sharing their research with us that interests them. And also I want to thank Emily McKellar for helping us promoting the events, and also Dr. Jessica Locke, Chair of the English Department, for facilitating today's discussion and presentation. And I also want to thank all the audience. I know all of us are all very busy, so I want to thank you for spending time with us and listen to our 3 fantastic faculties, their research and their scholarly interests. And so without further delay, I know we only have 1 hour and we have 3 presenters, so I just want to now yield the floor to Dr. Locke, the facilitator of today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Raylene, and thank you for hosting this this event. It's always so exciting to see the fascinating research that folks in our college are doing. So I was going to introduce people as they come up, and there have been 3 different orders. So I'll just go in the order that Raylene just read the names. I'll start by introducing Dr. Bob Bishop from the Philosophy Department. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at CSUSB. He received his PhD in philosophy from Florida State University. Before that, he studied philosophy and poetry, yay, at Carson Newman University in Tennessee. Now he works on ancient Greek philosophy, ethics, and action theory. And when I read Professor Bishop's biography, I was very excited because I'm also from Tennessee, and I was happy to see he's from Maryville, Tennessee, which is not spelled like it's smelled like Maryville, but it's definitely not pronounced that way in the South. So it's nice to meet you, Dr. Bishop, and go ahead.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Jessica. Do I have the ability to share my screen by chance? Let me see.
Yes, you do.
Okay, excellent. So I've got a couple objectives in today's brief presentation. The first objective is just a general introduction to my research program. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the 3 subfields of philosophy that influence my work. And then I'm going to sketch just one of my research projects briefly. So the 3 areas of philosophy that my research program bump up against are ethics, action theory, and history of philosophy. Ethics is roughly the inquiry into right action and what a good life looks like. Action theory is an examination of the sort of agency that seems peculiar to rational agents. So if you're driving along the road and a rock rolled down the hill and hit your car, you probably wouldn't get out of the car and yell at the rock. I mean, maybe you would, but after a little bit, you'd be like, okay, I'm not going to get anywhere with this rock. But if someone deliberately hit your car and damaged it, you would get out and probably have some words to say to that person. And it seems like that person would be the appropriate object or subject of blame. So there seems to be something going on in human action that's different than the other sorts of activities or actions that we encounter in the world. And action theory is really about what that peculiar sort of agency is that we find ourselves with. Lastly, my work ties in pretty closely to the history of philosophy. Part of that is just because I like history, but another part of that is that one of the peculiar things about philosophy as a discipline is that figures in the history of philosophy are seen as ongoing participants in philosophical debate. So because Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates had some really important things to say about ethics and action theory, they're sort of still present with us, making arguments that we have to grapple with as contemporary philosophers. So the thread that runs through these three areas is really just a question about how I should live. That's the question that really animates me. And today's project is fittingly right at the center of these three areas of philosophy, or rather the project that I'm going to sketch today is right at the center of these various areas. So the thing that I want to talk about today is the commemoration of tragedy. Now, I'm going to understand commemoration as a formal remembrance of a tragic event, but I think it's really important that commemoration has a ton of different vehicles. So a candlelight vigil can be an act of commemoration. So too can the construction of a monument, the reading of a poem, maybe even a cross-country walk can be an act of commemoration. Right. What is important is that human beings have this peculiar type of response to evil or badness, namely bringing it back to mind. And I think that that kind of response to tragedy is really philosophically peculiar. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about some of the things I and a co-author, Tucker Sigourney, have tried to resolve or explain in the commemoration of tragedy. And those three things are what we call, maybe a little bit broadly, three puzzles, but they're really just things that stood out to us when we first started thinking about commemoration and made us say like, like what exactly is going on here in these acts of commemoration? So the first thing that we're puzzled by is how remembering a tragedy involves the victims of a tragedy. We think that it's possible for us to commemorate some tragedy or the victims of some tragedy, even when the particular identity of those victims has been lost to time. But it nevertheless seems like commemorating tragedy is oriented towards or directed to the victims. And so the first thing we wanted to figure out is like, well, how exactly are the victims involved in what we think is commonly a representation of the tragic events themselves? We also wanted to try and figure out how remembering tragedy could be a case of honoring. So usually when we honor someone, we are responding to something that is praiseworthy about them, maybe something praiseworthy that they did, something excellent. But it doesn't really seem to be something praiseworthy about you if you are the victim of the tragedy, of a tragedy rather. And so we need some way of explaining what's happening in these cases of honoring that is different from our usual way of explaining acts of honoring. Lastly, I think there's the sort of question you might get from a cynical student in your classroom, like what exactly does commemoration accomplish? Oftentimes, tragedies are, in an important sense, irreversible. That is, some wrongdoing has occurred which we can't overturn, maybe because the victims have died or because the harm is so grievous that there's nothing we can do that properly compensates the victims. And so you might wonder what these relatively symbolic acts really are doing, what their point is. So I'm going to take these three puzzles in turn. I'm going to briefly sketch my solution to them, and then I'm going to get out of the way and let others talk since we have very little time. Okay, so let's talk about the puzzle number one, like how are the victims involved in tragedy? We think that victims are involved in tragedy because the commemoration of tragedy has a complex representational structure. So here we are borrowing from St. Thomas Aquinas on the structure of grief. St. Thomas says that grief is sorrow at the loss of something loved. That is, in grief, we represent something, namely the loss, as bad because we're representing something else as valuable or good or precious. We think something similar is going on in an act of commemoration. So the solution we want to offer to that first puzzle is that commemoration has a structure analogous to grief. So our question was something like, how are the victims involved in the commemoration of tragedy? And what we want to say is, even though the main point of the commemoration of tragedy is representing some event as evil, nevertheless, internal to that representation is a recognition that the victims were themselves precious and valuable. That is, the event is represented as evil in the commemoration of tragedy precisely because the victims have precious worth. Right, so this is how we think the victims are always involved in an act of commemoration, even when an act of commemoration sort of focuses on the tragic events and presents those events as evil without naming or going into detail about the particular victims. So that's puzzle number one. And that really is a point that is between the history of philosophy and action theory. If you want to, I don't know, map back to the general picture of how these three areas of philosophy relate to my work. The second puzzle was this puzzle about honoring, like what's going on when we honor the victims of tragedy. Being the victim of a tragedy doesn't seem to be something praiseworthy or excellent about you. And here we borrow from some things that Kant has said about the peculiar value of persons. So this really brief passage is from Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, one of the best, but also most confusing books of philosophy, I guess. My students hate me when I teach it, but I think it's got gems like the one I'm about to read you. Everything has either a price or a dignity. Whatever has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. On the other hand, whatever is above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. Now, one of Kant's maybe even obsessions is an attempt to examine or explain the peculiar value of persons. And he tends to think that that value has got three general features, though here we're into some controversial waters about Kant exegesis. The value that people have is inalienable, that is, it can't be stripped from someone. It belongs to each and every human being. And crucially, for our purposes, the value is non-fungible. That is, one can't exchange something with this value for another thing like it and not have lost something. The way that I illustrate this often in my classes is I ask students to imagine that they have lost a sibling, and then their parents come to them and say, "Don't worry, we'll get you another one." There's a sense in which that remark sort of misunderstands the precious value of a person because it sees them as essentially replaceable. Now, the solution, we think, to puzzle number 2 is that each and every person has this inherent dignity that Kant is talking about. And when we commemorate tragedy, what we are responding to is not an excellent character trait that that person has or something that that person accomplished. What we're responding to is that inherent dignity which circumstances or acts of evil cannot strip from them. It's something that each and every person has. So that's puzzle number 2. And that point is somewhere between ethics and history because Kant really is not yet doing action theory. He does love to do a bit of action theory, Kant. All right, so here's the third puzzle. And I asked you to imagine a sort of cynical student asking, like what exactly is the point of commemoration? Most of the time, tragedy is tragic precisely because we cannot make it right. And here I'm going to read from just a couple passages of our paper. So despite having a kind of inalienable dignity, we human beings have fragile bodies and we occupy a causal order that is subject to impersonal forces. Because of this, it often happens that our lives are cut short or irretrievably harmed. That is, often the way things turn out fails to respect our dignity. When a human being's life is determined by some external force rather than their own choices, the best response would be to undo the harm done to them, to make them whole. But sometimes we cannot, for we and the world can break things we are unable to fix. Even in such situations, we think that justice still makes demands on us. What the wrong demands is a kind of witness, that we understand the things that should not have been and express that understanding. Boy, that's a torturous sentence there at the end. So just listen to my words, don't read them. Right. So what we think is the solution to this question, what exactly is the point of dignity, is that the point of commemoration, is that the point of commemoration is to reaffirm the dignity of the victim in defiance to those events which ran contrary to that dignity. That is, it is a kind of public act of repudiation. A public way of saying these things should not have occurred, given the sort of thing that the victims are. And this point is, I think, squarely in the domain of ethics. So summing up, because I've tried to keep it under 15 minutes, and I think I've just about succeeded, we think that the commemoration of tragedy is the formal remembrance of some tragedy in which the tragedy is represented as evil in light of the inalienable dignity of the victims. Now, you might have noticed that Bob did not really offer any arguments in the course of this talk, but I had to choose between giving some arguments and saying what my view was, and I thought that it would be really confusing for me to give arguments and not say what my view was. So if you want to talk about it in the Q&A, if we have time for it, I think some of the strengths of this view is that it's better than certain alternative views, seeing the point of commemoration as our never forgetting a tragedy or preventing tragedy, or using some sociological or psychological explanation to explain acts of commemoration. We also think that this analysis of the commemoration of tragedy has some important payoffs. We think that it can explain what's wrong with the commercialization of commemoration and explain what is wrong with exploiting commemoration for political purposes. So thank you all for your attention and for being here today. I look forward to questions if we're going to have those, but if not, I look forward to seeing my other esteemed colleagues' research. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Bob. That was really fascinating and so very clear. I really appreciated that. So yeah, I'm excited. I wrote down all kinds of, it was making me think of all kinds of things. I'm looking forward to discussing that if we have time. Let me introduce our next speaker and we'll just sort of save our questions for the end, if that's okay. So Dr. Jonathan Robinson Anthony, let me pull this over here, is an assistant professor in the Department of English here at Cal State San Bernardino. His interests include bilingualism, psycholinguistics, language processing, cognitive control, and speech-language pathology. His research generally focuses on analyzing typical and atypical cognitive linguistic processes to better differentiate language differences from language disorders. He earned his MS in speech-language pathology and received his clinical training from San Francisco State University. And he subsequently earned his PhD in language and communicative disorders from the San Diego State University and University of California, San Diego Joint Doctoral Program. So I'll turn things over to you, Jonathan.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. And I just want to make sure that everyone can see my shared slides here. Yes. Okay. Awesome. So yeah, my research, when I was thinking about what to present today, I thought I would present a couple of snippets of research that I've done over my dissertation and what we're currently doing on campus here at Cal State San Bernardino with a few of our students in the program in the speech language pathology minor and prep program. So my interest is between normal functions of human communication, processes underlying impaired function, and new techniques for assessment and treatment. I'm interested in speech, language, and hearing sciences, particularly how this intersects with individuals who speak more than one language or bilinguals. Now, being in California, we have a very large population of bilingual speakers who use more than one language on a daily basis. So it's very it's very important, very how do I say relevant to our population in California, particularly in San Bernardino, where we have a large population of Spanish speakers and being at it in HSI. And so I want to start really quick with just a quick get your brain going. So on the screen, you should see 4 words here. And you're not required to say anything out loud, but just thinking about these words, how many do you recognize, come to their meaning fairly quickly, or how many do you have to give just a little bit more thought to, right? Now, if you speak Spanish, you probably notice some differences between the top 2 words, castigate and adorn, and the bottom words, perambulate and hoist. And that's because these words are similar or translation equivalents across languages. So castigate, castigar, adorn, adornar are very similar, and we consider them cognates, or words that share similar sounds and orthography across languages. And these are really interesting words for a variety of reasons that we're going to talk about today. But I want to highlight some work that's been done by a couple of our students in the speech language pathology minor and master's preparatory program and use this as an opportunity to hone in on what are cognates and how we define them. So cognates are words that are similar across languages. They share a similar phonology and orthography. And there are quite a few ways in research that we measure cognates. And the one that we're going to talk about in across these studies that I'm going to talk about uses the cross-linguistic overlap scale for phonology. So this measure takes into consideration 4 different criteria: the initial sound, the number of syllables, consonants, and vowels, in determining whether or not translation equivalents are cognates. And bilinguals typically have an advantage when it comes to processing these types of words because of this overlap. So we know this, sorry. So we know this because of work that we've done in word recognition tasks or in word production tasks, where these are generally processed faster, they have higher accuracy, they're named more easily. And the theory that we think drives this cognitive advantage can be exemplified in this bilingual language interaction network for the comprehension of speech. And so what this is demonstrating is if you look at the bottom here, where we see our letters or our phones, our speech sounds, this is the phonological level. And when we are listening to a word, for example, we begin to activate all of those sounds. And as those sounds activate, they then raise to the level of the word level, and they activate words that map onto those sounds until finally we get to the semantic level where we begin to activate semantic features associated with those words. And so what you'll notice is that on the, to my left here, but this is a picture of a pear. And the translational equivalents pear and pera are very close. They have a lot of phonological overlap. And so in theory, what's happening is this overlap is creating a very connected network that very quickly activates more features, getting up to the semantic level for an image like pear, or when you're listening to someone say the word pear, as opposed to a non-cognate, like the example hammer and martillo. They don't have quite as many overlapping sounds. And so when we're listening and processing the unfolding of that word, we're not getting the benefit of this cross-lexical interaction for promoting the activation of semantic features and ultimately coming to understanding the words that we hear. And so this is pretty cool, right? This is something that generally bilinguals are doing. It is Grosjean who says that bilinguals are not two monolinguals in one. They're instead someone or something completely unique, where we see this cross-lexical interaction and patterns that arise from that. So I want to give you an example of what a word comprehension task might look like. And that's going to set up how we're going to talk about the studies coming up. So we know cross-lexical interaction happens because we see this cognitive advantage on word recognition tasks, for example. So imagine that you are doing this word recognition task, you're presented with this visual word paradigm, there's 4 images, and you're instructed, show me elephant. So you will mark the elephant, and that's how we know that you understood what was said. And we can do plenty of analyses on the data. We can look at accuracy, how accurate are you in identifying the word? We can look at speed, how quickly do you identify these words? And these are all going to be factors that tell us about bilingual language processing. So these next two studies, I want to quickly share with y'all. This is work that was published in the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, as well as Bilingualism, Language, and Cognition, where we looked at this cognitive effect and looked at internal factors such as language dominance and whether or not our exposure to a second language, so to say, or our proficiency mediated this cognitive effect. And so I'm going to present some data from study from children, from adults. And what you'll notice here is that these are going to be typical, or at least what I think are typical profiles for our Spanish-English bilinguals in Southern California. What you'll notice is that the young children, they have a higher input and output of Spanish than they do English. And then our Spanish-English adults who are around college age, this seems to flip. This is very common that in Southern California, we have what's known as the language dominant shift, where most children hear the home language, the heritage language, and then once they enter school and they get formal education, this dominance pattern switches. So it's going to be interesting to see these results. So first here I'm showing is the results from our child study. And so just to get you oriented, on the x-axis, we have language dominance, where higher values index more Spanish dominant and lower values index less Spanish dominance. And on the y-axis, we have our cognate effect. So we're looking at accuracy, and we subtracted cognates from non-cognates And so this is getting that cognate difference. And so the higher the value, it means that they were more accurate on cognates than non-cognates on a receptive vocabulary task. And so what this is showing is that as our young bilingual Spanish-English participants had more exposure to Spanish or higher Spanish dominance, they actually had higher cognitive effects. And this is telling us that they're using information from Spanish to accurately accomplish this English task, right? And so that's letting us know that this interaction between languages is benefiting word recognition. Turning to our adults, so a very similar pattern arises. So we gave them a very similar receptive vocabulary task in English. And again, on the x-axis, it's flipped this time. So we have on the, as values increase, this is going to index more English dominance. And as values decrease, this is going to index more Spanish dominance. And what you'll notice here is that as participants are more Spanish dominant on this English task, again, we see a pattern of a greater cognitive effect, i.e. they are using information from Spanish to aid on this English task. For adults, we also did this task in Spanish just to kind of even out the, or balance out the findings, because it's one thing to see it on an English task. We also want to see it going the other direction. And we did, right? And so as our participants were more English dominant on a Spanish task, they similarly were pulling information from their English word knowledge to increase accuracy on the Spanish task. And so together, our adults and our children in the study, this is indicating to us that in typical populations, this cross-linguistic interaction seems to promote word recognition. And this is where my interest in the intersection of speech, language, and hearing sciences and bilingualism come together. So 1 in about 15 children are diagnosed with what's known as developmental language disorder. Developmental language disorder is just as it sounds. It's during the early years of development. Children have some difficulty or challenge with using, acquiring, or mastering language. And there's no known comorbidities or physical, etiologies that can be attributed to that. And so we see that children diagnosed with developmental language disorder have difficulty with vocabulary. They have smaller vocabularies than their typically developing peers. We see that there's lexical activation differences where words are activated slightly slower than their peers. And so I'm curious, for bilinguals who seem to benefit from this advantage of cross-lexical activation for word accuracy and word knowledge, does this same advantage hold for our participants or for our population of Spanish-English bilinguals who may have a language disorder where these are exactly areas of challenge? So this was the premise for a series of studies that I did that was funded by the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communicative Disorders. Particularly, we looked at 3 different areas of receptive vocabulary knowledge and processing, and I'll walk you through those 3 very quickly. And so the first study, again, we looked at receptive vocabulary, and we're just looking at what are the differences between our groups who report some history of speech language services and their peers. And so these are all going to come from adults, these next 3 studies. So we broke down the words in order of difficulty: easy, medium, and hard difficulty. So that's what we see on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, again, we have our cognitive effect on this English word receptive vocabulary task. And what you'll notice is that the black bar, which is our participants who do not report any history of services, and our dotted blue bar here, which are our participants who do report a history of services, they're quite similar. What this is indicating is that as vocabulary becomes more challenging, all our bilinguals are demonstrating a larger cognitive effect. And so this is telling us that in challenging word vocabulary, in challenging word and vocabulary situations, really pulling in the whole person or both languages is going to help with processing that information. Again, we also looked at this in a Spanish task. So we did both English and Spanish, and we see similar results. So both our participants with and without a history of speech-language pathology services are showing this larger cognate effect as the task becomes more difficult, and especially in Spanish, which is the less dominant language at this point for our adults. So this is telling us that regardless of a potential diagnosis of DLD, Spanish-English bilinguals are benefiting from this cross-linguistic interaction, and more particularly in challenging vocabulary. So hard words on these tasks were words like obelisk and low-frequency vocabulary. We followed up this study, this part of the study with an eye tracking task. So it's one thing to see this cognate effect on an offline, not timed, you're not rushed, you get all the time that you need kind of task where you have the opportunity to process the information and then come up with your answer. So we were more interested in, can we log into the online temporal aspects of word processing, and what will that tell us about cross-linguistic interaction and language processing? And so just to orient you here, what we have is a paradigm where there's a blank screen for about 500 milliseconds, that's half a second. Then the participants will see an image which has two pictures. One's going to be the target, one's going to be a distractor image. And that's on the screen for about 200 milliseconds before they hear what the stimuli is. So in this case, if they are tasked with identifying a cognate, they'll hear pair or beta if we're doing it in Spanish. Or if this is a non-cognate trial, they hear hammer or martillo. That will stay on the screen for about 300 seconds, so 300 milliseconds, so 3 seconds, before moving on to a blank screen and continuing the trials. And so what we're looking to see here is visually, the eyes need to give attention to information that it's processing. For example, you can't look away from the screen and do this task, you have to pay attention. And in paying attention, we can track on the screen where the eyes are looking. And so what this information will tell us is if there's a cognate effect, we should see more looks or a higher proportion of looks to cognate items than their non-cognate counterparts. And skipping to our results on that, it's kind of what we see, but let me walk you through what's happening here. So we have the proportion of looks to targets by type in this English task. On the top, we have our participants who do not report speech-language services. On the bottom, we have our participants who do report speech-language services. And along the x-axis, we have time. So this is just 1 second that we're recording here. And along the x-axis, we have our proportion of looks to the targets. And this black line, this solid black line, is going to be our cognate targets. And what you're seeing is that as time goes on, we have just above a 50% proportion of looks to those cognate targets for our typical participants on the top. And the dotted line just under that is our non-cognate targets. And so it's just below, right at that 50% proportion mark. We see a similar pattern with our participants with a history of speech-language service as well. And we're not really sure if this is telling us much about language processing because, again, cognates and non-cognates are so close. The two groups of participants look so different. And, sorry. And if we look at what happens in Spanish, voila, here's where we begin to see the separation of cognates, which are in the black, from our non-cognates, which are in a $9. And this is telling us that cognates are being activated more quickly and with a higher proportion of looks when we do this eye tracking task in just 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds. There were some more that I wanted to show about our participants and how they did on a thematically analyzed task where we look at their responses and analyze their metalinguistic awareness. Are they aware that there is some cross-linguistic interaction happening? And I would briefly just say, yes, it seems so. When we code for the types of responses that participants give during this interview, in this black bar here, this is demonstrating that our participants are giving a higher proportion of responses that indicates that they're aware of cognates and aware of this cross-linguistic interaction, at least on correct trials. But for incorrect trials, they aren't. So when they're getting it right, they know that they're using cognates. And when they're not getting it quite right, they are using other strategies. And so I will close with just making a plug. If you're interested in learning more about speech language pathology here on campus at CSUSB, we'll have an information session. And I will go ahead and wrap up there. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Yeah, so let me quickly introduce our last speaker, Dr. Debora Pérez Torres. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies here at Cal State San Bernardino. She holds a BA in Journalism and Media Studies from the Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Monterrey in Mexico. Apologies for my Spanish. An MA in Communication from the University of Utah and a PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on emotion, social identity, and media effects, particularly in the context of minority populations, namely Latinos. She teaches courses on strategic communication, media effects, global communication, organizational communication, and research methods. She lives in California with her marvelous husband, Dr. Benjamin K. Smith, who I saw was here today, and delightful daughter, Olivia. So, thanks, Debora.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Yes, that is my name. Sorry, I'm trying to find my footing here. Oop. All right. Can everyone see that? It's the question of our times with Zoom. All right. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you so much to Dean Trang and Diana and Emily who shared all the things with me, and I have so many questions. Thank you, Emily, for answering all of them super gracefully. So I am going to talk about some of my research. I really appreciated my colleagues' awesome presentations, just because I am bilingual, and the pronunciation of my alma mater was perfect. So never apologize for trying to speak Spanish, I think. So let's see. What I am going to do is going to present some of my research, my interest, and hopefully it will go great. My mom was here too, so hola, mami. And I am bilingual, so I found the previous presentation really interesting. All right, so I'll begin. All right, so first I wanted to start with a little bit of my background for those of you who don't know me, and I'll use this presentation as sort of an introduction to me. And it's the dean's fault for inviting me. So yes, I'll talk a little bit about my background, some previous research that I've done, my teaching, my current and upcoming projects. Then I'll focus in on a specific project that is kind of my research plan and agenda for the next foreseeable future. Then I'll talk about how my research links up to my teaching and my students, because most of this I do because of them. I always say that if this job didn't exist, I would have made it up for myself, because as my colleague has mentioned, this university has a large proportion of students who are just like me, right? Bilingual, Latino, and all of those wonderful things. A large diversity in our student population, which I enjoy, and I'm always like to include them in my projects. And then that will be the end. So by the time that I'm talking about student engagement, you can be sure that I will end soon. All right. So my background, as has already been mentioned in my introduction, is media and emotion. stress and coping, health in general, how can we improve health outcomes for particularly social minorities, underrepresented groups, specifically Latinos, because I am one. So this is my background. I completed my dissertation work, and now part of my projects are based on those projects that I've already started. This is what I called my credibility slide. I won't dwell too much on it, but it is just a little thing that believe me, I know what I'm talking about, kind of thing. So these are also my co-authors, and I also like to point to the wonderful collaborations that I've had been lucky enough to be part of. So as I mentioned before, this is my teaching, and most of it will deal with strategic communication, but I think part of the wonderful thing about communication is that it's so versatile, right? So I get to talk about my favorite things, including theory, including research, and I always tell my students, who some of them are here, which is very exciting for me, that research and theory, those things are really important, even if you're trying to just get your degree to be an event planner or a PR planner or strategic communication specialist, especially in those the sense that if we understand a little bit more about theory and research, what has been done before, then we will, oops, sorry about that. We are better able to manage all of those projects for our real world projects. So a lot of what I do is trying to integrate communication theories and research concepts into practice, right? So how do we get these very sort of sometimes diffuse, sometimes very complex topics, and how do we make them be applied to our students and our colleagues like day-to-day life, right? So that's kind of my approach to teaching itself. Now I will move on to talk a little bit about some projects that I have and that are upcoming as well. So, and it goes sort of from what has have already been sort of completed and analyzed to what my overall research agenda is for the next few years. So the first one is stress and coping among Latino populations. And if you can see my background, that is the poster that one of my students presented in one of our little conferences, mini conference for the Office of Student Research, who funds a lot of our work, which I'm really grateful for. So what I did for that is I focused on not general stress as we understand it currently, because we know that stress is bad. We know that it's damaging to our health. We know all of these things. We know less about how to address those issues, and we know even less about the specific stressors that certain groups, specifically ethnic and racial groups, how they deal with not just the general stress of family and work, but also discrimination-related stress, right? And within or apart from that, then also rejection-related stress, which I would define as rejection from an inner social group or like an in-group social group, right? So for example, if you are Latino, if you are a member of one of these social or ethnic minorities, you would understand rejection, meaning when you are within your group and someone who is also Latino says that you're not Latino enough, or like that you're doing it wrong, or like you don't count, or like you're whitewashed. All of that is stress as well, right? So people of color, Latinos, will feel not just the regular stress of work and family and obligations and all of these things, but added to that, we also have the discrimination-related stress of living in a country, in a society that kind of tends to mark us as different, right? So if you have any students and you or if you've been in a work situation where a superior or a colleague says something culturally insensitive, then you'll know what I'm talking about, right? These issues also translate, for example, to medical visits, right? Part of my focus is on health disparities. So it's not so much that Latinos by their very nature have something wrong with them that make them have worse health outcomes. It's not that. It's the way that we are treated in medical situations, right? So like where a white person will look for therapist and will find the first therapist to be great and work for them. A Latino or a Black individual might have to look for 20 different psychologists and see who is the person to speak to them in an inclusive manner, in a way that it's really helpful rather than harmful, right? So all of those things add up to even more stress. When I'm talking about rejection-related stress, is all of those kind of seemingly innocuous, sort of like, oh, well, you don't speak Spanish, so you're not Latino, or you don't speak another language, or you don't seem like you're Latino, or like you are too white, or you're whitewashed. All of that is also stress, right? So when you face discrimination stress, the sort of solution to that would be become closer to your group. But what happens then when even your group is telling you, like, no, you're doing it wrong. you don't get to be part of the group. So that is what I studied in this first research project. Not just also the types of stress that these populations feel, but also how they link up to different emotions, right? So for example, if you are stressed, you likely feel overwhelmed, kind of you're feeling a lot of pressure, all of these things, and likely you are able to deal with those things just kind of with physiological strategies. For example, I like to breathe, and I know I get a little nervous, so you'll notice me doing that too. I take deep breaths when I'm trying to concentrate. Versus if you are angry, right? So I study emotion as part of my research project. So emotion is a motivating emotion, right? Sorry, anger is, but it's also activating. It cannot be dealt with in the same way as general stress, right? Same thing with if it's rejection-related stress, it is more connected to a different type of emotion, like shame, right? So rather than doing something to fix it, it's not as motivating as anger might be. If you feel shame, then how are these individuals coping with that type of stress specifically? So that's what I'm looking for in this first project that I did. So the data has been collected for that. The analysis is ongoing because I have some wonderful undergraduate research assistants helping me with that. I did some qualitative responses for asking people how they deal with discrimination, how they deal with rejection-related stress and general stress, what those emotions look like, and what they do to cope with those types of events. So I will be analyzing this, and we just got funding for this summer, so I will be continuing with that. The second one is chapter on Frida Kahlo and cultural inclusivity. If you remember, Mattel, they did an Inspiring Women series. They included different people, different inspiring women, and one of them was Frida Kahlo. However, what they did was they completely removed everything that made Frida Kahlo Mexican, and kind of like the unibrow was gone, the mustache was gone. A lot of the focus was on her painting, kind of like more of those soft skills rather than the inclusion of the sort of how connected she was with the Mexican Revolution, how connected she was to socialism and all of these things. Like Leon Trotsky died in her house, like that. All of those things are very much the identity. And so what are we doing when we try to highlight a Mexican individual, but then remove everything that actually makes it interesting, right? So then we have this idea of like, well, and part of the analysis is also that the audiences that consume the Frida Kahlo and other types of media representations are so hungry or thirsty, or like they're so desperate for some sort of representation that you buy it for your kid, and you're like, okay, this is it's something at least, right? So that's part of the analysis in that chapter as well. Then I am the next part of what I am researching is Latino health disparities in the US in general. So this is a book proposal that hopefully will get funded, and I get to work on it next semester, which is all about understanding the underlying mechanisms of why Latino populations have worse health outcomes, right? And as I mentioned at the top of this slide, it's not so much as like essentializing cultures, like, oh, well, you're that, then that's you, and that's what you deserve, and that's what you get. It's more of explaining why that is. Why do we see a whole population of people who are just getting worse health outcomes beyond what seems to be explained by structural and economic, socioeconomic barriers, right? So, like, what is the explanation behind that or underneath that? So that's what I'm trying to uncover in this book. I'm also working with some students who have an interest in that for different populations, so hopefully it works out. And then the last one, and this is one of the ones that I'm most excited about, and I'll talk a little bit about it if I get time, because I'm already running out of time. But it's all about how then media representations can be a positive, right? So like a lot of my research and what I think makes it different from what I've what I've seen before is like, it's not just all bad, right? We know that people go to these media for reasons, right? Like there is a reason why we would go watch TV when we are stressed or when we are feeling down, or like why we search for kind of identity enhancing media as a way to feel more part of our group, to deal with all of those negative emotions and kind of to continue on with our lives, right? So because you can't avoid every racist person you meet, you can't avoid every culturally insensitive person that you will meet in your workplace, but you can deal with it. You can go home and watch Coco for the 100th time, and I'm never emotionally ready for what Coco does to me. But yeah, so that is one of my kind of I would say like the framework for all of these other projects that I'm interested in. So as I mentioned before, and this is kind of that last bit, is that stress has negative health outcomes, right? And I know I have 1 minute. But there are ways in which we can ameliorate those negative outcomes, right? A lot of research focuses on that type of work stress. What I'm trying to do is to establish the role of media-based coping, why it's important, and what it can do, especially for minoritized populations. If you are wondering what that looks like, let me show you, right? So like if you are Latino, then you know who America Ferrera is. You feel good when you listen to Hamilton said, immigrants, we get the job done. Like that is just like, you feel it. No, what is it? No pressure, no mistakes, no pressure, says Luisa in Encanto, right? So like that is the type of media that I'm talking about, right? So like it links up with your social identity, part of it, right? Because we're all multiple things, but it makes you feel proud, it makes you feel close to it feels like you're seeing something and you get it and it speaks to you. And it helps us to then perceive our social identity as a positive, maintaining it and kind of keeping it together and teaching it to our giving it to comes after us, right? It's not about us, it's about kind of leaving something for our students, which helps me to move on to now just 2 minutes, because I'm so proud of this, how my students are part of my research. As I said before, I have stress and coping among Latino populations as one of my main projects. This is one of my, 2 of my wonderful students presenting this at a mini conference that the Office of Student Research provided or funded, which is very nice. And we're got it for a second summer, so I'm very excited to keep working on it. And there's one space for a research assistant, so if anyone's interested. And then this is my more practical version of my current project, is the experiential learning through actual doing, right? Learning by doing. So what I have here is a few shots of my Coyote PR group or team. So we're trying to create this agency, creating like an actual sandbox for them to explore, right? Like similar to the Coyote Chronicle, right? We have student newspapers. Why can't we have an agency that functions as a real workplace? And we're not creating from the ground up. There's been some work done before, but I'm trying to kind of introduce all of the wonderful things that I know about this campus, right? So like a lot of my students are bilingual, which we had a presentation on that, which is great. They have multiple cultures. So let's get all of those things that makes us special and kind of highlighted in our work through this public relations agency. So I have a big focus on research and evaluation. So we have them work on real projects, what the client wants, and also it helps to increase that belongingness within the Department of Communication, right? So like trying to get everyone to like, you are part of this, like this is yours as well. You get to make of this class and this experience whatever it is that you want to do with it, right? And with that, I am a couple of minutes long. I hope that's okay. Thank you for paying attention to me and bearing with me. I get very nervous about these things.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. The work you're doing is fascinating and important. And yeah, all three of these folks, I mean, your work is just so timely for all of the things that our local communities and our world are dealing with right now. So yeah, so we do have about 4 minutes for questions if people want to ask any of our three excellent presenters today. I have a quick question for Jonathan, if y'all don't mind. I was interested in, you may have written about this and that's why I'm thinking it, and I've heard it before, but if there's a false cognate effect, so that, you know, like I'm thinking of like libreria in Spanish means bookstore and not library. So do you see students who are people who are bilingual having that, where that slows them down when they try to identify this stuff?
Yeah, good. And that's real intuitive thinking, right? And yes, to briefly answer your question, yes, so false cognates, we have, when we're thinking about cross-linguistic interaction, these can be positive interactions where we see facilitation effects, or they can be negative interactions where we see sort of inhibitory effects happening, right? And so these false cognates are just that, where we're not able to use that information as readily. But the good thing is there are far fewer false cognates or false friends than there are cognates. But an interesting line of research if you're interested in speech production, where, yeah, that's a whole thing.
Thanks.
And I will say that, yes, that one trips me up. Library, libreria, and bookstore, and biblioteca, and all of those. And lime and lemon, if anyone speaks Spanish, that is a tricky one, because it's English speakers got it wrong.
Yes, Molly, go ahead.
I just want to thank you all. Fascinating presentations. And I actually had a question for Dr. Torres. Can you tell a little bit more about the PR agency? Are you working with outside companies? Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yes, we are not currently, because it's the second time that I've taught it, but we don't have any money. And so we are kind of working on a shoestring budget and just our energy. So we're working with the comm department to increase our visibility. Thank you, Matthew, or Professor Poole. And we are also working with the Undocumented Student Success Center. So those are our clients, right? So we're trying to do as much as we can in terms of publicity, PR strategy for those two clients at the moment. But, you know, if you have any ideas, they're always welcome. We're kind of trying to establish that kind of for the next foreseeable future, I would say.
I'll follow up with you.
Yes, Ron, go ahead.
Congratulations to all three presenters. Wonderful work. Question for Bob. I understand the philosophers think about things either way. You think about tragedy in terms of victims. I was thinking about another way to think about it, that is probably some kind of sociological point of view. That is, we celebrate tragedy, we talk about it, we read about it, go to play, go to theaters to kind of see plays about it. Well, maybe also the event itself is unique, is important, is meaningful. So rather than, well, I would say to celebrate, to honor the victims, but also maybe the event itself. I don't know what it is. Tragedy as an event to me seems profoundly meaningful. So that just threw it out there for you both to think about or to respond to.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting point, Ron. So we're trying to theorize about tragedy from what you might call the inside view, like what people who are commemorating tragedy take themselves to be doing. So we do think there are other ways of explaining the practice of tragedy from various sociological perspectives or psychological perspectives. But I think what's really interesting about your comment is that it may be that our analysis doesn't capture everything that we care about from the inside view. It may be that part of what commemoration does for us is it has maybe a uniting effect on the community, and we take ourselves to be engaging in a practice that is uniting or worthwhile in and of itself. When we commemorate tragedy. It's really interesting. I'll have to think about it more. I think my general thought right now is that it would be problematic for us to lose sight of the importance of the victims in the commemoration of tragedy. But that is certainly, our not losing sight of them is compatible with there being other things that are important to us in such acts. So it's a really interesting point. I'll think about it more. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're at the 102 mark, so I think maybe we should probably close. But this was a wonderful presentation from three really fascinating researchers, and thank you all so much. Thank you for coming out, everyone, for this in the middle of the day. And I wish you all a good rest of the Thursday. And yeah, Raylene has put in the chat, the next events that are coming for our both for the Cal Research Spotlight. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for facilitating the discussion, Jessica, and also our three presenters, Deb and Jonathan and Bob. You all did a great job. So I look forward to seeing you in our future presentations. So this coming Thursday, we have Handmaid's Tale, Dr. Adria Algon and Dr. Jessica Locke. And Dr. Bobby Smith will be doing their analysis of Handmaid's Tale. And we also have the other 2 episodes of our second-year tenure track faculty's presentation. So we look forward to seeing you all in their presentation. Again, thank you all for coming and take care. And thank you, Emily and Diana, for helping us organizing today's fantastic events. Bye-bye. Take care.